Bobcats are solitary hunters that typically view domestic cats as prey, not companions. So, when a stray calico slipped into the bobcat enclosure at the Maryland Zoo, the staff braced for the worst. Inside, in the habitat ruled by a male bobcat named Rocky, protocol collided with compassion. Should they remove the stray immediately, or keep watch, take notes, and hope for the impossible? Margaret, a senior wildlife specialist, arrived within minutes, just in time to witness something that made her coffee cup slip from her hands and shatter on the concrete. In 3 decades of wildlife work, she had never seen anything like it. Rocky wasn't just tolerating the intruder. He was grooming her, sharing his food, and guarding her. Why did this unlikely pair choose each other? What happened next? No one was ready for. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning mist still clung to the Baltimore harbor when Margaret Sullivan arrived at the Maryland Zoo for her early shift. As the senior wildlife rehabilitation specialist with over 30 years of experience, she'd seen countless unusual animal behaviors, but nothing could have prepared her for what awaited her that crisp October morning. The zoo grounds were peaceful, with only the distant calls of waterfowl breaking the silence. Margaret made her way through the familiar paths, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, her mind already running through the day's feeding schedules and health checks. The bobcat enclosure was always her first stop, not because protocol demanded it, but because Rocky, their resident male bobcat, had become something of a personal project since his arrival 3 years earlier. Rocky's story was one of survival against the odds. Found as an orphaned kit near the Appalachian foothills after his mother had been struck by a vehicle, he'd been too young to survive on his own and too habituated to humans to ever be released back into the wild. The decision to provide him with a permanent home at the zoo hadn't been taken lightly. Wildlife rehabilitators always aim for release whenever possible, but Rocky's circumstances made that impossible. He'd adapted well to his spacious enclosure, designed to mimic the rocky outcrops and dense vegetation of Maryland's western counties, where bobcats still roamed wild. As Margaret approached the viewing area, she noticed something odd. Rocky wasn't in his usual morning spot, the elevated platform near the back wall where he typically surveyed his domain with the regal bearing characteristic of his species. Instead, he was lying near the feeding station, his tawny coat catching the early morning light. But he wasn't alone. Margaret dropped her coffee cup, the ceramic shattering on the concrete pathway. There, curled against Rocky's warm flank, was a small calico cat. Clearly domestic, clearly not supposed to be there, and clearly still breathing. The sight defied everything Margaret knew about bobcat behavior. These were solitary, territorial predators. In the wild, a bobcat would view a domestic cat as either prey or competition. Rocky himself had shown typical bobcat aggression toward the feral cats that occasionally wandered too close to his enclosure's perimeter. Yet here he was, sharing his space, and apparently his breakfast, with an intruder. Margaret's training kicked in immediately. She radioed for backup while carefully observing both animals for signs of injury or distress. The calico was thin, her ribs visible beneath her patchy orange, black, and white coat. Her left ear had an old notch in it, likely from a long-ago fight, and her fur was matted in places. She was clearly a stray who'd been living rough for some time. But she showed no signs of injury from Rocky, no defensive posturing, no fear. She was simply comfortable. Dr. James Patterson, the zoo's head veterinarian, arrived within minutes, followed by several other staff members. They all stood in silent amazement, watching as Rocky gently groomed the calico's head with his rough tongue, a behavior typically reserved for mothers with their kits or bonded pairs in the wild. "How long do you think she's been in there?" James whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever spell had been cast over the enclosure. Margaret studied the scene with her expert eye. The food dish was empty but showed signs of being shared rather than fought over. There were no scattered pieces, no defensive positioning. "At least since last night's feeding," she concluded. "Maybe longer." The challenge now was what to do about it. Protocol dictated that the calico should be removed immediately. There were liability issues, safety concerns, and the fundamental principle that wild animals and domestic animals shouldn't be housed together. But as the morning wore on and more staff gathered to witness the unprecedented situation, it became clear that any intervention would need to be carefully considered. Thomas Bradley, the zoo director, arrived by mid-morning, having been pulled from a board meeting by increasingly urgent messages from his staff. A pragmatist by nature, but with a deep respect for animal behavior, he watched the pair for a full 20 minutes before speaking. "Tell me about Rocky's demeanor," he finally said to Margaret. "Any signs of stress? Aggression? Territorial marking?" Margaret shook her head. "Nothing. If anything, he seems more relaxed than usual. His body language is completely calm. Look at his ears. They're forward and relaxed, not pinned back. His tail is still, not twitching. These are all signs of a content bobcat." The calico, perhaps sensing the attention, stretched luxuriously and padded over to the water bowl. Rocky watched her drink, then joined her, the two animals sharing the resource as naturally as if they'd been raised together. "We need to document this," Thomas decided. "Set up cameras. Monitor them continuously. If there's any sign of aggression, we intervene immediately. But if they're truly coexisting peacefully, well, that's something worth understanding." The next 72 hours were crucial. The staff established round-the-clock observation, with Margaret leading the effort. She watched as the unlikely pair developed a routine. The calico, whom the staff had begun calling Patches, would hunt the mice that occasionally ventured into the enclosure, a behavior that Rocky watched with what could only be described as amused interest. In return, Rocky shared his daily food rations, even stepping back to let Patches eat first. The most remarkable moment came on the second evening. A raccoon had climbed onto the enclosure's mesh ceiling, likely attracted by the scent of food. Rocky immediately went into defensive mode, his wild instincts kicking in. He positioned himself between the potential threat and Patches, who had been sleeping in a sunny corner. The raccoon quickly retreated, and Rocky returned to Patches' side, settling down with a protective posture that Margaret had only seen in bonded pairs of wild bobcats. By the end of the week, the zoo had a decision to make. The story had somehow leaked to local media, probably through one of the younger staff members' social media accounts, and visitors were already asking about the bobcat and housecat friendship. But more importantly, separating the animals now seemed potentially cruel. They had established a bond that, while scientifically inexplicable, was undeniably real. Dr. Patterson conducted a thorough health examination of Patches, temporarily sedating both animals to ensure safety. Patches was approximately 3 years old, spayed, indicating she'd once had a home. And despite her thin frame, relatively healthy. She tested negative for diseases that could affect Rocky, and after some deliberation, the veterinary team decided she could stay, with conditions. The enclosure would need modifications. A smaller shelter was added specifically for Patches, giving her a space that Rocky couldn't access if she needed solitude. Additional climbing structures were installed to provide more vertical territory for both animals. The feeding protocol was adjusted to ensure both animals received appropriate nutrition. Margaret took the lead in monitoring their ongoing relationship, and what she observed challenged many assumptions about interspecies bonding. Rocky, despite being a wild animal, showed remarkable restraint and even affection toward Patches. He would often groom her, something bobcats typically only do for their own young. Patches, in turn, seemed to understand Rocky's boundaries, never pushing for attention when he displayed any signs of wanting solitude. The pair played together in ways that astounded the staff. Patches would initiate chase games that Rocky would participate in with controlled intensity, never using his full strength or speed. They developed a form of communication, a series of chirps and purrs that seemed to convey meaning between them. Margaret documented it all, recognizing that she was witnessing something that could contribute significantly to understanding animal behavior and cognition. As weeks turned into months, the story of Rocky and Patches became legendary not just at the Maryland Zoo, but throughout the wildlife rehabilitation community. Researchers from Johns Hopkins University came to study the pair, looking for insights into animal bonding and communication. Animal behaviorists from across the country requested access to Margaret's observation logs. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was on the zoo's visitors. School groups would stand mesmerized, watching Rocky and Patches basking together in the afternoon sun. Elderly couples would sit on the nearby benches for hours, finding comfort in the unlikely friendship. Margaret often overheard visitors drawing parallels to human relationships, how differences could be overcome, how kindness could transcend natural boundaries. One particular interaction stood out to Margaret. An elderly veteran named Robert Thompson had been bringing his grandson to see Rocky and Patches every week. One day, he approached Margaret with tears in his eyes. "I served in Vietnam," he said quietly. "Saw things that made me believe the world was nothing but violence and survival of the fittest. But watching these two, it reminds me that there's still gentleness in nature, still surprises, still hope." Margaret found herself deeply moved by his words. In her 3 decades of wildlife rehabilitation, she'd focused on the science, the protocols, the best practices, the measurable outcomes. But Rocky and Patches had taught her something beyond science. They'd shown her that sometimes the most profound moments in nature were the ones that couldn't be explained by textbooks or research papers. The scientific community remained divided on how to interpret the relationship. Some experts argued it was simply a case of mutual benefit. Patches provided companionship that reduced Rocky's captivity stress, while Rocky provided protection and shared resources. Others suggested it might be a form of misplaced parental instinct on Rocky's part, though his behavior didn't fully support this theory. Margaret had her own theory, one she only shared with her closest colleagues. She believed that intelligence and emotional capacity in animals were far more complex than humans typically acknowledged. Rocky had been rescued young enough to understand that not all cats were threats or prey. Patches, having lived as a stray, had developed survival instincts that allowed her to read Rocky's body language and respond appropriately. Together, they'd created something unique, a relationship that transcended the typical predator-prey dynamic. The zoo developed educational programs around Rocky and Patches, teaching visitors about bobcat conservation, the importance of wildlife rehabilitation, and the complex nature of animal behavior. Margaret led many of these sessions, using the pair's story to illustrate broader conservation messages. Bobcats once roamed throughout Maryland, she would explain to attentive audiences. Habitat loss and hunting reduced their numbers dramatically. Rocky can never return to the wild, but his story and his unusual friendship with Patches helps people connect with wildlife in a personal way. That connection is the first step toward conservation. The programs were incredibly successful. Donations to the zoo's wildlife rehabilitation fund increased by 40%. More importantly, several visitors were inspired to become wildlife rehabilitators themselves, with Margaret mentoring several new volunteers who cited Rocky and Patches as their inspiration. As the first anniversary of Patches' arrival approached, the zoo organized a celebration. It was a modest affair. The animals wouldn't understand or appreciate fanfare. But it gave the staff and regular visitors a chance to reflect on what the unusual pair had taught them. Margaret stood before the gathered crowd, her weathered face bright with emotion. In wildlife rehabilitation, we often talk about success in terms of release rates and survival statistics. But Rocky and Patches have taught us that success can also mean adaptation, that sanctuary can be found in unexpected places, and that the bonds between animals, like the bonds between humans, don't always follow the rules we expect. She paused, watching as Rocky and Patches lounged together in their favorite sunny spot, completely oblivious to their celebrity status. They've shown us that nature still has the capacity to surprise us, to challenge our assumptions, and to remind us that gentleness and cooperation are just as much a part of the natural world as competition and predation. The crowd applauded warmly, many wiping away tears. Among them was a young girl named Elizabeth, visiting with her grandmother. She tugged on her grandmother's sleeve and whispered, "Grandma, do you think they really love each other?" Her grandmother, a retired biology teacher who had been skeptical of anthropomorphizing animal behavior, looked at the peaceful pair and smiled. "You know, sweetheart, I think they do. Maybe not in the way humans understand love, but in their own way, yes. They've chosen each other, and sometimes that's what love is. Choosing to be gentle when you could be fierce. Choosing to share when you could take everything for yourself." As the seasons changed, Rocky and Patches continued their unlikely cohabitation. They weathered Baltimore's humid summers and chilly winters together, their bond seemingly growing stronger with time. Wildlife photographers from National Geographic came to document them. Researchers published papers about them. Children drew pictures of them that lined the zoo's education center walls. But for Margaret, the most meaningful moments were the quiet ones. Early mornings when she'd arrived to find them grooming each other. Lazy afternoons when they'd play together with the enrichment toys she'd provided. Evening feedings when Rocky would wait patiently for Patches to eat her fill before approaching the dish. These moments reminded her why she dedicated her life to wildlife rehabilitation. Not just to save individual animals, but to understand them, to learn from them, and to share their stories with a world that too often forgot the wonder of the natural world. As she wrote in her final observation log entry for that first year, Rocky and Patches have proven that the boundaries we draw between wild and domestic, between predator and prey, between possible and impossible, are sometimes more fluid than we imagine. They've shown us that kindness exists in nature, not as weakness, but as a form of wisdom. In a world that often seems divided by differences, they remind us that connection is possible in the most unlikely circumstances. Their story isn't just about a bobcat and a stray cat who became friends. It's about the capacity for gentleness that exists in all living things, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The story of Rocky and Patches continued to inspire long after that first remarkable year. They lived together for many more years, their bond never weakening. When Patches eventually passed away from old age, Rocky mourned her in his own way, and the zoo staff mourned with him. But their legacy lived on in the countless people they'd touched, the research they'd inspired, and the simple but profound message they'd shared. That in a world full of divisions, friendship knows no boundaries. Margaret retired a few years later, but she often returned to visit Rocky, who lived out his days as the ambassador for his species, teaching new generations about the wonders of wildlife. And whenever she told the story of the stray cat who broke into the wrong enclosure, she would end with the same words. Sometimes the most beautiful things in nature are the ones that shouldn't exist according to our rules. Rocky and Patches reminded us that nature doesn't always follow our textbooks, and that's exactly what makes it magical.